harsh scrape of bronze blades striking solid stone echoed through the temple corridors, drowning out the hurried footsteps of the priests. They hadn't come to honor the gods. They had come to carry out a sentence of total erasure. Each methodical blow reduced to dust the face, the titles, and the very existence of the most powerful woman in the entire ancient world. The Egyptian Empire, a civilization that devoted its very soul to securing the eternal life of its rulers, mobilized the full force of a nation with one single, chilling purpose: to erase the memory of that queen forever. For 3,300 years, the desert sand sealed the success of that merciless political retaliation, until a quiet accident revealed exactly what the system had failed to hide. When we think of ancient Egypt, the first image that comes to mind is one of absolute preservation. Pharaohs carefully mummified through elaborate rituals, colossal pyramids built to defy eternity, and secret tombs sealed with incalculable treasures. Everything in that society was meticulously designed to ensure that the afterlife would be safe, glorious, and everlasting. But what happens when that same civilization, wielding unchallenged power, decides to do the exact opposite? What happens when the relentless machinery of the state is turned not to immortalize a name, but to completely obliterate someone's very existence? That question leads us straight to the anatomy of Nefertiti's erasure. What you're about to witness is not a simple story about a limestone bust resting in silence inside a cold European museum. The true story of this ruler is an intense archaeological thriller, forged in religious heresy, the sudden shattering of thousand-year-old traditions, and a disappearance so abrupt it happened at the very peak of her authority. The weight of spiritual death. To truly feel the weight of what was orchestrated against her, we need to step inside the mindset of that era. To the ancient Egyptians, chiseling someone's face and name from stone walls was not a simple act of censorship or a demotion in political rank. It was, in every sense, a sentence of spiritual death. This methodical practice, which the Romans would later call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, carried one terrifying purpose: to block that soul's access to the world of the dead. The belief was unmistakable. If your name was written nowhere, your soul ceased to exist. You were condemned to wander the void forever. It was the ultimate punishment, a fate reserved only for the most dangerous enemies of the nation. And Nefertiti, who ruled alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten, wielding a level of influence nearly unmatched by any woman before her, became the central target of that revenge. Together, they had challenged the very foundation of the empire, stripping control from the priests and imposing a radical new order on everyone. The system's response was devastating. If you value the recovery of these historical truths that the powerful tried to silence forever, consider subscribing to our channel right now and joining us on this investigation. From this moment forward, we'll trace how the most influential woman of her era was systematically turned into a ghost in the official records of state. We'll follow how political rage organized battalions of workers to reduce her statues to powder, and how, in a stunning twist of irony, the very fury of her enemies made one fatal miscalculation, leaving behind the single detail that would make her unforgettable. Before we step into the barren sands of the Egyptian desert and fully grasp the magnitude of what happened to this queen, I have a quick invitation for you. Drop a comment below telling us what city, state, or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know the people who value real history, and we make a point of reading and responding to every single one of you. Your presence here is what drives our investigation forward. Now, we need to travel back in time, specifically to the undisputed height of the 18th dynasty. Egypt wasn't merely a kingdom. It was the absolute superpower of the ancient world. Gold flowed freely from the mines of Nubia. Trade routes delivered unimaginable riches, and order was maintained through the worship of the ancient gods, led by the mighty deity Amun. The high priests, based in the grand city of Thebes, had accumulated so much land and influence that they directly rivaled the authority of the pharaoh himself. It was a rigid, 1,000-year-old system, and an extraordinarily profitable one. When Pharaoh Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne alongside Queen Nefertiti, something began to fracture. Nefertiti was no decorative figure meant to walk passively behind her husband during ceremonies. The records carved into stone place her on a level of equality that shocked the conservative elite. She wore crowns strictly reserved for kings and is depicted in postures of absolute dominance, symbolically striking down the enemies of the nation. Together, they ruled as two inseparable halves of a centralizing, deeply radical power. But the couple's boldness went far beyond breaking gender protocols. In a sweeping act of political and spiritual force, the pharaoh changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning devoted to Aten. The solar disk, previously a minor deity, was elevated to the status of the one and only unquestionable god. In an irrevocable decree, the worship of Amun was completely banned. The colossal temples of Thebes were locked shut, the priests' vast wealth was seized by the crown, and the names of the ancient gods began to be systematically scraped from monuments. An entire nation was forced to abandon its beliefs overnight under direct threat from the state. To cement that final break, the couple abandoned Thebes, the ancient capital that still breathed the deep resentment of the dispossessed priests. They ordered the construction of a brand new capital built from nothing in the middle of a harsh, unforgiving desert, the city of Amarna. Building that city exacted an extreme human cost. Battalions of workers were torn from their fertile lands along the Nile Valley and forced to march under the scorching sun, raising white limestone temples on barren ground. The city was dedicated entirely to light, designed with roofless temples, so that the cutting rays could burn down onto the altars. The heat inside bordered on unbearable, reflected off the blinding white stone. Dust hung in the air without rest, filling the lungs of the city still taking shape. The psychological and physical toll of sustaining this new world order was enormous. That burden showed clearly on the faces of those who governed. The art of Amarna abandoned the static perfection of the past. In the depictions of Nefertiti and Akhenaten from this period, there are no placid smiles or idealized, flawless features. The stone reveals real faces, ordinary, marked by time and deep tension, bodies with imperfections, slightly slumped shoulders, and exhausted expressions. It was the raw, human portrait of leaders crushed by the weight of maintaining a revolution surrounded on all sides by enemies. While the new capital buzzed with forced devotion, the pillars of the empire were collapsing fast. Clay tablets revealed dozens of desperate letters from governors begging for troops. Strategic cities were falling to invaders. Urgent pleas for military help ran headlong into the bureaucratic silence of Amarna. The royal couple, eyes glazed over with daily solar rituals, completely ignored the collapse of their defensive network. The empire was bleeding from every border. But inside those walls, the only thing that mattered was maintaining the perfect image around the solar disk. Recent forensic research paints an equally devastating picture of life inside the city. Cemeteries at Amarna reveal the grim price paid by the common people. Bones marked by stress fractures, severe signs of malnutrition, and a shocking infant mortality rate all confirm that the spiritual dream was built on a machine of suffering. Adding to the pressure, evidence points to a deadly disease sweeping through the region at the time. The concentration of exhausted workers turned the capital into a perfectly vulnerable target. Grief struck the royal family without mercy when Nefertiti's own daughters died young, shattering the illusion of divine invincibility. Yet even in the middle of that sanitary chaos and military collapse, Nefertiti's political influence showed no sign of weakening. In the last artistic representations before the Great Erasure began, the king's figure visibly diminishes, while the queen's grows to dominate every scene. She takes on the unmistakable profile of a fully independent ruler, an absolute commander, holding the reins of a society hurtling toward irreversible rupture. The fury of the silenced power brokers in Thebes intensified with every setback on the streets of the ailing capital. The resentment was no longer just a matter of wounded faith. It had become a coldly cocked political weapon. They watched each failure of the government like shadows lurking just outside the torchlight. Every piece of lost territory was one more argument for the violent counterattack being drawn up in absolute silence. The power Nefertiti had cultivated seemed unshakable against the desert storms. But history is ruthless, and it teaches us that the fall always begins at the exact moment authority reaches its peak. The state's machinery of revenge was already armed, waiting only for the right moment to pull the trigger. At the precise instant when Nefertiti held more influence and command than any other woman of her age, the clock of empire reached a fateful marker, year 12, a threshold in time that would change the course of the ancient world, laying the dark groundwork for one of the most calculated and inexplicable disappearances mankind has ever witnessed. Year 12 of that pharaoh's reign should have represented the undisputed summit of the New World Order he and his queen had forged from the sands. Records carved into stone document a grand diplomatic festival in the capital, a meticulously staged event designed to display the crown's unshakable power. Ambassadors from distant lands had traveled for weeks across merciless routes, carrying gold, ivory, and rare spices just to lay them at the feet of the ruling couple. In the official images that survived from that era, the queen isn't merely present as a luxury companion. She dominates the entire scene. She distributes honors, accepts heavy tributes, and acts openly as the backbone of an empire that, though bleeding on its distant borders, still maintained the illusion of absolute control within its limestone core. She had climbed to the highest point of the political hierarchy. No seasoned advisor, no battle-hardened general, and absolutely no dispossessed priest would dare challenge in broad daylight the authority of the woman who shared the throne. But history proves to us time and time again that power concentrated too tightly attracts a silent and relentless reckoning. And in ancient Egypt, the great structural breaks of state rarely announced themselves with formal declarations or military fanfare. They arrived quietly, often cloaked in the cold, calculated mantle of bureaucracy. And it was exactly that cold that moved in. Without any prior warning, without a single explanation dispatched to the alarmed provincial governors, the most influential woman of her era vanishes completely from every official record. When specialists today pore over the clay tablets that documented the crown's dense diplomatic exchanges, her name simply stops appearing. When we look at the stelae that narrated victories, banquets, and ceremonies, the female figure that once dominated the stone carvings is abruptly cut off. And this is not a natural, gradual decline, the kind where a leader ages and peacefully transfers influence to her heirs. We are looking at a documentary guillotine, an immediate blackout at the exact moment she held with steady hands the reins of the most complex civilization in the ancient world. To grasp the crushing weight of that sudden absence, we need to remember how that people handled the loss of their sovereigns. The passing of a ruler of this magnitude should have been an event designed to bring the entire state to a standstill. There would have been mandatory mourning decrees proclaimed from the top to the bottom of the Nile Valley. The funerary machine, the richest and most revered industry in the nation, would have been immediately mobilized to prepare the Queen's journey into eternity. There would have been months of costly embalming rituals, processions thick with incense smoke, and laments echoing endlessly through the streets. Court artisans would have worked to physical exhaustion, building a final resting place worthy of an undisputed ruler. But the archives deliver absolutely none of that. Not a single papyrus recording a decline in her health. No mention of a noble burial. No official mourning decree, no institutionalized grief, no order instructing the humblest citizens on how to honor the memory of their fallen queen. It is as if the machinery of the state decided, in one authoritarian snap, that she had never drawn breath. Have you ever been in a room where the air is so thick it feels like speaking above a whisper will have irreparable consequences? That suffocating tightness in your gut when everyone knows a devastating truth, but no one has the courage to look sideways? That was the exact human atmosphere hanging over the palace corridors. Servants passed with heads down, cleaning the plaster floors with trembling hands, trying to become invisible. Long-serving advisors exchanged only quick, fearful glances, knowing perfectly well that questioning the whereabouts of the supreme commander would sound like direct treason against the crown. Some researchers argue she may have been a victim of the deadly disease sweeping through the region, the same plague that had already claimed her own daughters. Contagion makes no distinction between the dust of the streets and the gold of the palace. But even if that disease had broken down the queen's defenses, her physical death would not justify the denial of sacred burial rites. A ruler who died on the throne still demanded the rituals required to cross the waters of death. The gaping hole left in the documents of that era does not reflect the grief of a biological tragedy or a sad twist of fate. It reflects the blunt force of a repression. The public narrative was being suffocated, deliberately, and without a shred of mercy. The husband, locked away in his blind devotion to the solar god, continued signing decrees and trying to sustain the mirage that the capital remained unshaken. But the disappearance of his centralizing partner tore a massive political abyss directly beneath his feet. The great diplomatic shield that had kept the court insulated against the hatred of those silenced in Thebes for more than a decade was now completely shattered. And it is at this exact moment, as we sink into the cold of what was never written in the documents, that our investigation reaches its heaviest conclusion. The absolute silence that swallowed Nefertiti in year 12 was not a display of respect. It was not the contained trauma of a nation in mourning, and it was not a diplomatic exit from the stage. That cutting silence was, in truth, a terrifying prologue. It was irrefutable proof that the clock had been reset for the revolutionaries. The sudden disappearance from the official records functioned as the surgical, tactical preparation for the greatest, most aggressive, and most relentless political retaliation in all of antiquity. The Egyptian empire was not mourning its great leader. Deep inside the reopened temples, the empire was, in secret, sharpening its chisels. The silence that swallowed the ruler at the height of her power was not a natural void. It was the held breath of an empire on the verge of explosion. Shortly after her documentary disappearance in year 12, the very Pharaoh who had envisioned the revolution met his inevitable end, leaving the desert utopia completely exposed. Without the relentless force of the royal couple to keep the heavy gears of the new order turning, the structure of state collapsed at a staggering speed. The power vacuum was not filled by diplomacy or peaceful transitions. It was filled by the rage of a full decade of resentment and absolute isolation. The one who seized control of the empire was not an heir faithful to the principles of the light. It was the supreme commander of the armed forces, a pragmatic general, forged on the front lines of great battles, who immediately understood that his hold on power required an unbreakable pact with the dispossessed ancient priests. They wanted their immense temples back and demanded that the endless flow of gold be restored to the sacred coffers. But far beyond any material gain, they demanded the complete annihilation of that revolution's memory. The retaliation orchestrated in the stone corridors of the old capital was not a chaotic revolt led by people in the streets. It was something exponentially more methodical and frightening. It was a minutely designed operation, executed with the cold precision of government bureaucracy. The religious leaders invoked the most terrifying punishment that existed in the rigid, unwritten code of the ancient world, a systematic military erasure that would tear the king and, above all, the sovereign image of the great queen from historical and spiritual existence. To understand the immeasurable terror that this specific condemnation represented, we need to grasp the unshakable faith of that people. For them, the collapse of the physical body was only the first step of a long crossing toward eternal life. The survival and vitality of a soul in the world of the dead depended strictly and non-negotiably on the preservation of its carved image and the constant writing of its name in the land of the living. A name was not merely an identifier, it was the spiritual anchor that kept the soul from dissolving into the cosmic void. If the name was reverently spoken aloud by the priests of the state, the ruler's essence kept breathing across the centuries. But if that same name was methodically scraped away and the image erased, something dark occurred, what they called the second death, an irreversible condemnation to perpetual non-existence, a final banishment to a dimension with no light, no return, and no memory. And that was the exact devastating force unleashed to punish the woman who dared to change the destiny of the Nile Valley. Exhausted battalions of workers were reassembled by the crown's security forces. The same groups of men who had once marched to raise the luminous city now trudged beneath the merciless desert heat to carry out a radically opposite order. They carried no measuring ropes or fine pigments, only sharp bronze chisels, coarse stone files, and heavy hammers built for aesthetic demolition. When the long columns of those annihilation troops crossed through the walls of the isolated capital, they found a metropolis already beginning to be swallowed by the abandonment of its former faithful. Under the cold stares of high-ranking military commanders, the relentless process began. The sharp, harsh, mechanical sound of blades cutting into limestone surfaces came to dominate the soundscape day and night. Institutionalized, silent hatred has all the time in the world to do its work. Skilled workers erected dangerous networks of scaffolding around towering monuments, enduring sheer exhaustion just to reach the highest points and obsessively scrape away every recognizable feature of the most powerful woman of her age. Monumental statues, which had absorbed months of hard labor in distant quarries, were hurled to the ground with crashes that shook the surrounding structures. The orders on the worksite allowed no failures. The royal features had to be pulverized. Where the image of extreme, unquestionable authority had once rested, there now remained only a dense layer of white limestone dust covering the arid ground beneath the workers' bare feet. The sheer scale of that task force revealed, with bitter irony, the degree of panic the new administration carried toward the ideological shadow of that fallen ruler. Every detail carved into the great public courtyards was closely inspected by military overseers. If a wall revealed her distinctive crown, the hammer went to work, striking the rock repeatedly until deep, hollow scars replaced it. If inscriptions narrated military and diplomatic victories, the small symbols were obliterated into opaque, meaningless blocks. The image of her imposing figure leading troops was replaced by raw cuts in the original facade. And this carried a terrifying psychological weight. Many of the men now forced into that methodical destruction were the very same individuals who had once dedicated their lives to idolizing and sculpting that same commanding figure. The relentless dust of the demolition coated their skin, clouded their vision, and settled day after day into the exhausted lungs of an entire society being forced, through brute physical effort, to dismantle the very foundation of its own recent history. The punitive campaign found no comfortable boundary in the majestic palace plazas or the elite residences. Armed squads invaded smaller settlements across the region, tearing apart bureaucratic reports, smashing administrative seals from the era, and reducing to unrecognizable rubble hundreds of small, secret devotional objects still kept in residential chapels by desert farmers. The army's purification plan reached such an extreme that enormous structural blocks of storage warehouses in the northern regions of the empire were dismantled, simply because certain foundation stones still bore, nearly invisible to the eye, the official acknowledgement of past authority. That relentless, ongoing amputation of identity consolidated itself, remarkably, as the single greatest logistical operation of that turbulent period, sending a thunderous warning to every citizen. The old rules and the ancient gods had returned to power, absolutely. When the chisels of the troops fell silent and the immense walls of the visionary city bore the dull white scars of aggressive scraping, the state applied its final phase with calculated coldness. The vast imperial supply network permanently sealed its access routes, and commercial borders were shut tight. The elaborate water channels that had carried a lifeline to that isolated place dried up fast beneath the punishing sun. The towering silos and emergency reservoirs were completely emptied of their grain and transported back under heavy armed escort. Without the extraordinary resource investment that kept the capital artificially functioning in the middle of nowhere, the entire grand architectural project collapsed within months. The desert reasserted its dominion. The muffled winds of the plain drove tons of cutting sand into the abandoned throne rooms. buried corridors that had once echoed with supreme power and sealed forever, the floors covered in the residual dust of civic destruction. That great spiritual and visionary promise transformed, gradually and irreversibly, into a colossal monument-sized tomb, wide open to the emptiness of the centuries. The old masters of the ancient faith smiled with relief as they reclaimed the gilded seats in the reopened temples, holding the arrogant, unshakable certainty that the silence of their punishing blows would triumph intact and unbroken for the rest of human life along the banks of the river. The great strategist who pulled the strings and forced the foundations of that entire world to bend had humbled herself before the crushing machine of immense bureaucratic amnesia, sealing her fate and locking a glorious name in the dark dungeons of programmed oblivion. For an uninterrupted 30 centuries, that cunning government plan functioned with flawless precision, violently protecting its fallen rubble and burying every dangerous mystery of a revolutionary reign deep within the thick, endless dunes. But no great military machine of repression holds enough engineering or raw force to master the unforeseeable subtleties of absolute time. The high priests could never have been shrewd enough to predict that their perfect revenge, every last shred of immortality ripped away with cruel chisels, would drain away in humiliating fashion through the gap of one extraordinarily mundane oversight in the final moments of the official retreat. The empire had carried out its punitive mission with terrifying efficiency. The solar capital had been returned to the desert, and the ruler had been torn from the memory of the living. For 3 uninterrupted millennia, the sand kept that state's secret tightly sealed. But time has a relentless patience, one capable of playing cruel tricks on political systems that try to rewrite the course of humanity by force. The chronological leap takes us directly to an incredibly cold December morning in the year 1912. A German expedition led by archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt was working methodically through the forgotten ruins of Amarna. The constant wind lashed the faces of the local workers who were not digging in search of gold treasures or royal tombs, but trying to understand the foundations of a peripheral residential structure. Records on clay tablets indicated that this area had once belonged to a man named Thutmose. He was no general, no priest. He was simply the master sculptor of the royal court. As the crew removed tons of fine sand bearing the rooms of the ancient workshop, metal shovels struck something solid in the packed dirt floor. The piece was not positioned on an altar of honor or locked inside a sacred vault. It was lying on its side, discarded in the middle of rubble and dull plastered debris. When careful hands brushed away the dirt petrified by time, chance returned to the modern world exactly what state-sponsored hatred had been absolutely certain it had annihilated. Beneath the cold desert light, the nearly intact colors of the Nefertiti bust emerged from the earth. The historical irony of that instant is overwhelming. The armed squads that had torn through plazas to destroy obelisks and scrape official records searched for the queen only on the grand stages of power. In the rush to punish and abandon the city, the commanders overlooked the backstage of the empire. A dusty civilian craftsman's studio did not merit a second inspection. And by leaving that ordinary room behind, the censors allowed a single limestone work to survive and mock every bit of the government's planning. When we look at that bust today, we immediately understand the dread that this ruler stirred in the restored regime. There is no smooth, artificial face of a distant deity. The sculpture reveals a real woman, without empty vanity or the features of an idealized model. The straight neck projects a quiet authority, and the mature features carry the incalculable exhaustion of someone who sustained a radical revolution entirely on her own shoulders. It is the genuine face of someone who held with firm hands the wheel of absolute power. That routine failure by the demolition troops ensured that the woman sentenced to the spiritual void became the most celebrated female face of all antiquity. Her image was saved by the involuntary protection of the earth, permanently securing her historical legacy. But a far denser and more unsettling mystery remained hidden in the silence of the valley. The stone art had survived the bronze hammers, but what truly happened to the physical mortal remains of the leader who shook the order of the world? The hunt for that final answer was about to leave the desert sands and step directly into the cold, restricted environment of modern genetic mapping laboratories. The search for truth has left the desert sands and entered the modern laboratories of Egyptology. If the face survived the hatred of the state, where is the physical body? In the Valley of the Kings, secret tombs like Cave-i-Taiv shelter anonymous female mummies that continue to defy contemporary science. DNA testing attempts to cross-reference the royal bloodlines and identify the lost ruler among those forgotten remains. But a bold theory is gaining serious traction among researchers. What if her disappearance in year 12 was not a defeat, but an extreme tactic for survival? Strong evidence suggests that after the loss of her husband, she may have assumed a male identity, ruling alone as Pharaoh Smenkhkare. That would explain the documentary blackout of her female phase and the definitive absence of her original tomb. Nefertiti did not evaporate into the shadows. She changed the rules of the dynasty and became the empire itself before the night closed in around her. The erasure of the great desert queen stands as the greatest paradox in the history of human civilization. The ancient religious leaders and military generals mobilized the full financial and structural power of the empire to annihilate her existence, silence her name, and dismantle her legacy. They held the unshakable certainty that they had sentenced her to the eternal void. But the heavy machinery of the state failed decisively against the unpredictability of time. Thanks to a single limestone sculpture abandoned on the dusty floor of an ordinary workshop and protected for 3 millennia beneath untouched sand, the ruler condemned to non-existence became the most celebrated and commanding face of all antiquity. Whether she seized ultimate power on her own terms or still rests hidden in the deep shadows of the Rocky Valley, the undeniable truth remains. Political retaliation lost its war against memory. The bureaucracy of resentment crumbled, but she survived. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. Subscribe to our channel and keep uncovering the true face of the past alongside us.